Good afternoon, everybody. This is Liz Neal. In this presentation, I intend to introduce you to the subject of delimitations and limitations and offer differences and provide examples of each so you will have a better understanding of where these concepts fit into your own dissertation projects. First, it's important to know that the limitations and delimitations section of your research project is in place to identify conditions that can impact or restrict the analysis and methods of your research data. According to Dr. Marilyn K. Simon, author of a book titled Dissertation and Scholarly Research, Recipes for Success, it's important to know that limitations are potential weaknesses and are out of the control of the researcher. Now, as a side note, this book, co-authored with Jim Goes, relates all things dissertation to food, recipes, and cooking. Rarely will we find a perfect individual research project. With this in mind, it's common for a research project to have at least one limitation. As previously stated, limitations are factors that cannot be controlled by the researcher, yet they do place stipulations or restrictions on your research methods and findings, and they must be written in your research project. On a positive note, limitations offer the opportunity to identify areas needing further research. Let's venture outside the world of educational research for a brief exploration of limitations in medical research. This, I believe, is where we will begin to fully understand and wrap our brains around what limitations mean for our own research projects. According to Lynn Connolly, Associate Professor and Director of Nursing at Benedictine College, in a 2013 article outlining common limitations, she states that common limitations might include sample size and selection. If the quantitative researcher used a convenient sample rather than a random sample, as is most medical and nursing research practice, then difficulties exist in generalizing to larger populations, and findings only can be suggested. If the sample in qualitative research is not the best group of people to access for the knowledge the researchers are trying to obtain, this is also a limitation. Another limitation is missing data, particularly if a significant amount of data is missing. On surveys, respondents may not answer a certain question accidentally or because they are uncomfortable or do not want to answer the question. Lack of data can also be due to attrition from the study. This is particularly a problem in longitudinal studies. A lack of literature is a problem for quantitative research, as there may be no empirical or theoretical basis for doing the study. This can be a positive argument for conducting a qualitative study in order to identify the phenomena. Data collection instruments may not have sufficient reliability or validity. The researcher still may choose to use them if they are the only ones available, but this limitation, as all limitations, should be acknowledged. Reliability estimates should be reported for the present study. Also, self-reported data not verified through other sources can have possible limitations depending on the topic in the study. People may have selective memories and may get timing of events wrong or attribute positive events and outcomes to their own actions and negative events and outcomes to external forces and exaggerate the significance of actions and events. Very common to limitations in the medical field, limitations in educational research are synonymous. The University of Southern California online library guides identify possible limitations we may see presented in our own research projects. If you are working through a qualitative research project, in conducting your own research, or if you are dependent on data that already exists, self-reported data is typically not verifiable, creating a limitation. Consider this example. Interviewing educators regarding their perception of online testing. To begin, the current timing on this matter, at least in the state of Tennessee, might provide a negative bias. And secondly, as with any interview, the researcher is making an assumption that all answers are true and honest. Also, the sample size used must be large enough to measure significance, especially in quantitative research. As writing guides will explain, the sample size must be large enough to ensure a representative distribution of the population. When considering research topics, I sincerely wanted to measure the impact our RTI implementation is having on our ELL population because I can see great things happening in my own classroom. However, my 7 Hispanic students do not qualify as a significant sample size. When considering limitations created by the measurement tool used to gather data, a researcher may determine that they worded a survey question in a manner that didn't allow for a clear answer, or perhaps, looking back, would have added or omitted a question. This information must be acknowledged as a limitation. Limited research on the research topic is a strong opportunity for further research, yet is still a limitation. And last, much like limited prior research, limited reliable data is a limitation that also needs to be noted and can lead to the need for further research. Dr. Shannon Sullivan published her dissertation in 2003, where she studied the perceptions of 7th and 8th grade girls toward coeducational physical education classes in 5 middle schools in East Tennessee. Sullivan discusses only one limitation, a low return rate of surveys, as you can see here from her limitations and delimitations section. She states, a limiting factor of the study was a low return rate, 52% of the questionnaire, possibly because of the age of the students participating in this study, their reluctance to share personal information, and their reluctance, as well as that of their parents, to sign the informed consent form. As a final note on limitations, it is very important not to confuse limitations with negative results. Negative results do not support the hypothesis in place, which can be caused by a number of factors, but is still not a limitation. Consider these thoughts from Frank Parajes, who I will talk more about later in the presentation. A limitation identifies potential weaknesses of the study. Think about your analysis. The nature of self-report, your instrument the same. Think about threats to internal validity that may have been impossible to avoid or minimize, and explain. Again, referring back to Dr. Marilyn K. Simon, the biggest difference between limitations and delimitations is that limitations are not controlled by the researcher, and the delimitations are those characteristics that limit the scope and define the boundaries of your study. The delimitations are in your control. Frank Parajas, who I've already mentioned, is a professor at Emory University who compiled a set of writing guidelines titled The Elements of a Proposal. He states, a delimitation addresses how a study will be narrowed in scope, that is, what are the boundaries. This is the place to explain the things that you are not doing and why you have chosen not to do them, the literature you will not review and why not, the population you are not studying and why not, the methodological procedures you will not use and why you will not use them. Most importantly, limit your delimitations to the things that a reader might reasonably expect you to do, but that you, for clearly explained reasons, have decided not to do. Dr. Stephen Yates, a graduate of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky, completed his qualitative dissertation in 2009 titled Current Faculty Development Practices for Alternative Delivery Systems in Christian Higher Education Institutions. In this section, he notes 6 delimitations, the first being the institution used in his research only being Christian institutions of higher education. Second, only institutions affiliated with the Association for Biblical Higher Education were used. Third, only institutions were used that fell under the umbrella of hybrid and distant models. The remaining 3 delimitations, as you can read, deal with choices he made as the researcher, which specifically define delimitations. As you work through Chapter 1 of your research project, you will need to consider both limitations and delimitations and how each may impact the analysis and methods of your data research. Based on the Chapter 1 dissertation guide from the content section of our Research in Educational Leadership class, the limitations and delimitations section will fall into Chapter 1 of your dissertation, just after the definition of terms section, and it should be approximately 2 pages, depending on the specifics of your own research. Hancock and Algazine state that you should explain your reasonings for any delimitations and or limitations of your research and describe your plans for addressing any negative consequences resulting from your decision. McCaslin and Scott, co-authors of The 5 Questions Method for Framing a Qualitative Research Study, explained limitations and delimitations best. They say, delimitations put a fence around the study, and limitations are generalizability, credibility, advantages, and disadvantages of the study. Here are a few ideas for consideration and discussion regarding limitations and delimitations in general and specific to your own research project. First, Ellis and Levy remind us that limitations are unavoidable. So discuss how you, as the researcher, reduce the possibility for multiple limitations. Now, this is tricky because limitations are typically discovered once the research has already been conducted. Secondly, when researching examples of limitations and delimitations, I discovered the topic of assumptions woven into information on limitations and delimitations. Our Crathwall and Smith text states that assumptions underlie all studies. Discuss the potential for assumptions in your research project. Also, have you identified confounding variables thus far? And last, how differently do limitations and delimitations look in qualitative research as opposed to quantitative research? Thank you for watching and listening. I look forward to discussing limitations and delimitations with you.